Everyone had a nice lunch. It's great having the after lunch session because everyone's kind of sleepy and no one's really listening, so you don't get the hard questions at the end. I'm Rebecca. I'm head of research for a digital NGO called My Society. We're concerned with international digital development, so we work with grassroots organizations all over the world to try and build relevant, culturally appropriate digital tools to enable citizens to better communicate with their governments in whatever form is most appropriate. So this paper I've been doing here, this study was kind of a pilot study. So this isn't like finished, definitive research. This is kind of very much the beginning of a journey for me and for the organization. We really wanted to see how our tools, how other people's digital tools are having any kind of impact on the people that are using them. I think probably in this conference and in many other conferences that deal with digital tools, we see a lot of presentations about something that's being built or something that's just been built and it's mega shiny and it's, mega exciting and you think, wow, this could change the world. And a lot of the time, those kinds of initiatives you might not hear much of again. An awful lot of people build something and then it kind of fades away because people didn't use it or because in some way the technology didn't work or the data wasn't there. So one of the things that we're really trying to do at My Society in partnership with other universities is try and look at the actual human impacts of digital tools. So the research question we started with was actually quite broad. We wanted to know how, if at all, civic technology was impacting on citizen attitudes towards government. As I say, we were trying to make digital tools to enable citizens to better communicate with the government, to better understand government, to better understand how bureaucracy works and how to negotiate it. So this is kind of a catch-all question, and it was deliberately vague. It was designed so that we can actually find some interesting things that we might want to focus on more in the future. How many people have heard this term, civic technology? Show of hands. Not many. I'm not surprised. Civic technology is very much a practitioner term. So if I'm on GitHub, and if I'm sort of talking to the coding community, if I'm talking to the community of NGOs or the UN or Oxfam about civic technology, these people understand what I'm talking about because it's very much something that practitioners in this area use. And it's described by the Knight Foundation, who are big funders of this kind of work, as a non-profit technology used to empower or engage citizens to make government more acceptable, more accountable, more transparent, more responsive. And the fact that this term civic technology is quite alien to people more on the academic side, I think is actually kind of an issue. Because civic technology is something that people that do it use to describe themselves. And I think it's distinct from a lot of the things that it kind of gets grouped together with. A lot of the time it will be grouped under e-government or the very kind of broad label of ICTs. I will use ICT and technology kind of interchangeably during this presentation. But ICTs can cover a lot of things. E-government can cover a lot of things. And there is a distinction with civic technology in that it emerges from a grassroots, non-governmental sphere. Civic technology is developed by people outside of government, often using government data, but it is more of a grassroots, bottom-up process rather than a lot of e-government initiatives, which tend to be a very kind of top-down, bureaucratic solution, rather than something that's genuinely designed or co-created with the people that will actually be using the technology. So one of the key themes that we were looking at with this research is accountability and transparency. Now, we could stand here all day talking about accountability and transparency. Everyone in this room will be very familiar with these concepts and these themes. Looking around the literature, at what can be linked to ICT usage, to e-government, to civic technology. There are a few pieces of literature out there that have kind of linked the use of ICTs in facilitating accountability and transparency. But this kind of technology, this kind of initiative very much requires the government to play ball. If you're going to build something, if you're going to build a digital tool to enable people to communicate more effectively with their government, a lot of the time you need government information. You need that high quality, up-to-date data from government, because data is the oxygen of civic technology. If you deprive a digital tool of data, then it will shrivel and die, it will suffocate. Because without up-to-date data, digital tools will not be accurate, they'll not be effective, citizens will lose trust in them, and then you have people that have been doubly disillusioned, potentially, by both their institutions and the digital tools that were designed to circumvent those. And information needs to be disclosed by governments in usable and understandable formats. Those people that have followed the work of Jonathan Fox will have read a couple of studies by him around this idea of not just disclosing information, not just disclosing data, but disclosing it in an actual usable format, or in a way that can be useful to whoever uses it. I don't know how many people there are in the room that do coding or programming or anything, but the worst thing you can have when you ask for information to build something is a PDF. Because if you get information in a PDF, you then have to build something else to scrape everything off the PDF. And you have to keep doing this ad infinitum. So what we were really examining, and what you can read in the paper, is personal efficacy, citizen efficacy. And in terms of efficacy, we were looking at that kind of external efficacy. There's a lot of papers that deal with external versus internal efficacy. This is really about people's perceptions of their institutions. We were really wanting to kind of scratch under the surface and find out not only how people kind of perceived the institutions that they were dealing with, but how responsive those institutions were to them and whether they felt like they could make a difference. There's a difference here between actual and perceived responsiveness. This is obvious. It's very easy for someone to kind of perceive that a government may behave in a certain way without having facts to prove that. Following a transaction or following an action by the citizen, that perception may well change. That might not be anything to do with what the government actually does. The government may have made no change or done nothing to facilitate that change in perception. And it's very important in this context to understand the power of information. Institutions are well versed in understanding what power information has and in controlling the flow of information to create a kind of narrative that is normally favorable to themselves. Citizens, I think, do understand that information is power, but in a less sophisticated way. That's changing in the last kind of 10, 15 years, the rise of social media, the rise of blogging. Information is far kind of more accessible, but so is misinformation. So it's really interesting in this kind of study to look at who is using information in what way, where people are getting their information from, what sources do people find their information from, and do they trust those sources? Do they trust those sources equally? There are, again, there's much evidence in the literature to show that publication of official information can increase public confidence in government. But again, that is very much dependent on what information is published, what format it's published in, and what kind of narrative goes with it. So the research itself, as I say, this was very much a pilot project. This was to kind of uncover specific places where we wanted to go with much more detailed research. So we did 4,371 survey responses. These surveys were placed on 5 different platforms across 4 different countries. So in the UK, we had theyworkforyou.com and fixmystreet.com. Those websites are run by the organization that I work for. In the USA, we had GovTrack. Kenya, we had Mzalendo.com, and in South Africa, we had peoplesassembly.org.za. So all of these are civic tech platforms. The USA, Kenya, and South Africa platforms were run by volunteer groups or very small NGOs. So these are, again, not non-profit organizations that have civic technology interests. And the focus was on platforms providing official parliamentary information, so PMO sites, if you will. We also use documentary evidence, web stats, and analytics to back this up. The reason we chose these 4 or 5 sites to actually put the survey on and to use is because they're very similar, but also because we wanted to have a look at what differences there were between these very different countries. You know, these 4 countries have fairly sophisticated parliamentary systems, fairly engaged populations, fairly well-educated populations comparative to other countries. And we were quite pleased that there was the kind of Western, UK, US split to the Kenya and South Africa sites. The other reason we chose a lot of these sites is because they actually have very high usage. You know, there are parliamentary monitoring sites in many places in the world, but you'd be lucky to get more than 5 or 6 people a day looking at them, whereas these sites are incredibly well used. So we had a few really interesting findings, and they're hopefully things that are going to point us in some really interesting directions moving through the second stage of the research. Over 90% of participants across all countries believe that being able to see up-to-date official parliamentary information via these civic tech platforms enabled them, at least in part, to hold their government to account. That's pretty big. It's easy to tick yes to these kinds of questions. But the fact that people made a distinction between in part or in full, it was actually quite powerful to get this back. We know there are flaws in this. What someone thinks of as, you know, holding their government to account will be completely different to another person. We know this is subjective. We know that different people will understand how they hold government to account personally in very different ways, and that's something that we want to look at in a lot more detail. But the fact that there are people that believe that being able to see this information enables them in some way speaks to that personal efficacy that we were looking for. It speaks to the fact that people are seeing information, they are trusting it, and they are personally confident in understanding and using it in whatever way they see fit. And you can see here that in each of the countries, very, very small percentage of people saying no. Another one of our key findings was that 82% of participants across all countries believed that their governments would behave differently if citizens were unable to see this information. Again, this is a subjective thing. This is something that in future studies we want to go into, drill down into, get a lot more detail on. But this is an indication that people have that the mistrust of government that a lot of people have, and that they believe that without this information, without access to this information, without being able to access this information online whenever they wanted, that governments, may in whatever way behave differently. These people might think they might behave more negatively. People might think they would be more corrupt. It's not something that we have the detail on yet, but again, just as a kind of indication, this is really interesting, that people think that if this information was not accessible, their governments would materially behave differently. And demonstrating a little bit that this kind of civic tech platform is not just an add-on or a kind of hobby horse. Over 50% of participants wouldn't know how else to access this information other than on these civic tech platforms. That's a lot. If you think these are parliamentary monitoring websites, so the people that are on these websites are already going to be politically engaged, for the most part. I think in this survey, I think about 70% of people said they consumed political news on a daily basis. So these are people that are already politically engaged to a certain extent. And still, a small majority would not have known how to access this information otherwise. I mean, this speaks to a failure, I think, on the part of a lot of parliaments in providing decent data, in providing readable, usable information, in building websites that are searchable or usable for the common person. One of the interesting things in running theyworkforyou.com in the UK is that a lot of our traffic comes from inside Parliament. You know, we can track the IP addresses, and there is a huge amount of people working inside the UK Parliament that do not use the parliamentary website to get parliamentary information. They come onto our website to get it because it's packaged in a far easier, more searchable, and user-friendly way. So this speaks to the fact that those civic tech sites in those 4 countries that we looked at, it's filling a void, it's filling a gap. If those sites weren't there, then these people potentially wouldn't be getting the kind of information that they want or they need to enable them to hold government to account in whatever way they see fit. And the other thing that was really interesting, it's not, this isn't necessarily to do with efficacy, but the demographic splits were really, really interesting. In the UK and the USA, civic tech users resembled the dominant political class. In the UK and the USA, the users were generally male, they were generally white, they were generally educated, and they were generally fairly affluent. Most of them, I think 77% in the UK and the USA, were over the age of 45. So these are people that really are already fairly, have fairly high personal efficacy, who are already fairly politically engaged. The interesting thing was when we compared that with Kenya and South Africa, the demographics were very, very different. These sites are being more embraced by younger people. So again, I think it was pretty much similar to the UK and USA. So at 75% of users that were actually under the age of 45. A lot of users that didn't have a university education. The spread of use was more ethnically diverse. Really resembling the kind of profiles that we're seeing in some of the protest movements in South Africa and in Kenya. And that's really, again, that's really important for maybe not studying personal efficacy, but certainly for studying the future of civic technology in these kinds of countries, because I think it's very easy to say, there's a problem over there, let's build a tool, and we can just pick it up and move it over here, and it'll solve the same problem. Clearly it won't, because these sites are reaching different people in different places. And I think this is, again, a really strong advert for that kind of grassroots up kind of development, rather than the kind of e-government top-down approach that we see quite often. So, in conclusion, is civic tech increasing citizen external efficacy? There's a strong indication of that. Again, as I say, this is kind of just the beginning of our research at My Society. I can't stand here and say definitively that yes, this definitely increases efficacy, but there's a strong indication that that's the case. People are using these sites and they're finding them useful. They think that without access to this information, their governments would behave differently. If they couldn't access these sites, they wouldn't know where else to get that kind of information. So these are kind of important thoughts, important talking points for moving this research on. At the moment, we have a randomized control trial running in Kenya, looking at how people from different demographics are using and responding to political information through this parliamentary monitoring site. We're recruiting people from Facebook that have never been on the site before and providing different treatments to see if this makes any difference in personal efficacy as well. So this is kind of a great jumping off point for us and I'm hoping that it'll start conversations with other civic technologist researchers as well. Important to say, though, and it's something that I've noticed this morning in the sessions, and I'm sure will come up again and again during this conference, the digital divide exists. You know, it's a thing. It's not going away. It's very evident here. Obviously, we were looking at parliamentary monitoring organizations that, to a certain extent, are kind of the preserve of a slightly more educated class anyway. But this is something that is really, really important if we're trying to go beyond the efficacy of people that are already engaged and try and build it in people that are disengaged currently. There's great work on this going on in the UK, and I know some great work in Australia, and some of the presentations I heard before lunch were really, really interesting in getting young people from different backgrounds into technology through different means. So that's pretty much it. I'm happy to answer any questions now, or if you want to speak to me on the side, that's fine too. But thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.